Cojeul River. After a few days on rest, we relieved the 10th Company in the front line on the 9th of December. Our part of the line was in front of Vis-en-Artois, as I mentioned above. My company front was bounded on the right flank by the Arez-Cambrai road, and on the left by the marshy bed of the Cojeul River, across which we kept touch with the neighboring company by nightly patrols. The enemy's lines were hidden from sight by a hill lying between the front lines. Apart from an occasional patrol messing about with our wire at night, and the hum of an electric light engine set up in Hubert's farm not far off, we had no knowledge of the enemy. On the other hand, the frequent gas attacks were unpleasant and claimed many victims. They were carried out by means of hundreds of iron cylinders buried in the earth and discharged by electricity in a salvo of flame. As soon as the light showed, gas alarm was given, and anyone who had not his mask on and the flap well tucked in found himself in a bad way. In many spots, too, the gas reached an almost absolute density, that even the mask was useless, since there was literally no oxygen there to breathe. Consequently, there were many casualties. My dugout was in the steep wall of a gravel pit behind the line, and was shelled nearly every day. Behind, the iron girders of a destroyed sugar factory showed up in grotesque desolation. The gravel pit was an unholy spot. Among the shell holes, filled with the refuse of war, the crosses of fallen trench dwellers stuck up awry. At night I could not see my hand in front of my face, and I had to stand still between Viray lights in case I fell off the duck boards into the marsh at the edge of the Cojeul. I spent the days, when I was not busied over works of construction going on in the trench, in the ice-cold dugout, reading a book or drumming my feet against the dugout framework to get some warmth into them. A bottle concealed in a niche of the chalk served the same purpose, and the remedy was sedulously applied by my orderlies and me. If the smoke of a fire, however small, had wound up into the still December sky, the place would have become utterly uninhabitable. So far, the enemy took the sugar factory to be headquarters, and behaved accordingly. Thus, it was not till evening that we came alive. The little stove was then lighted, and spread genial warmth as well as thick smoke. Soon the pots and pans of the ration party, just returned from Viz, clattered down the dugout stairs. They had been long and eagerly awaited. And then, when the eternal rotation of Swedes, barley, and dried vegetables was interrupted by beans and dumplings, our joy knew no bounds. As I sat at my little table, I used to listen with delight to the racy talk of the men crouching in a cloud of tobacco smoke over the stove, on which stood a pan of grog diffusing a powerful odor. War and peace, battle and home, rest place and leave, were discussed in the dry Lower Saxon way. Love, too, played a leading part. On the 17th of December I went on leave, and came back on the 2nd of January. On the 19th of January we were relieved at 4 in the morning, and marched through the snow to Gouy. Here we were to stay some while, training for the great offensive. Ludendorff's marvelously clear scheme of training, which was distributed even to the company commanders, foreshadowed the scope of the coming attack. We practiced skirmishing in line, and open warfare, and did a lot of shooting with the rifle and the machine gun. As all the villages behind the line were crammed to the attics, every little slope was in use as a range, so that the bullets whistled about the country very much as in a battle. A machine gunner of my company shot the CO of another unit off of his horse, while he was reviewing some troops. Fortunately, the wound was not mortal, and equally fortunately, the deed was not clearly brought home to us. Sometimes I made practice attacks with the company on complicated trench systems, with live bombs, in order to turn to account the lessons of the Cambrai battle. Here, too, we had casualties. On the 24th of January, Colonel von Oppen, who was esteemed by all, left us to take over a brigade in the far southeast. The whole regiment keenly felt the loss. During the long years of the war, he had become part of the life of the troops he commanded. Besides the warm sympathy he took in the destiny of those under his command, he had a quality not very common among officers who have grown old in the monotony of peacetime soldiering: the power to adapt himself to the immense innovations brought about by the war. Such a man can effect marvels in wartime. Unfortunately, his last words, "Auf Wiedersehen in Hanover," did not come true. Our beloved colonel saw neither his country nor his proud regiment again. He fell victim to plague, and lies in foreign soil, far from his own country. On the 6th of February we moved back to Lecloise again, and on the 22nd we spent 4 days in the shelled area left of the Duray-Hendecourt road, and went on working parties into the front line at night. As soon as I saw this part of the line, opposite the slag heaps that used to be Bullecourt, I was certain that a part of the great offensive, of which the Western Front was talking with bated breath, would be launched at this point. Everywhere construction was going forward with feverish haste. Dugouts sunk, roads laid down. The shell-hole area was beset with little placards standing in the open and displaying incomprehensible figures that denoted, presumably, the positions of batteries and headquarters. Our aeroplanes flew to and fro in a phalanx to prevent observation by the enemy. A novelty that interested us on this front was that every day, precisely at 12, a black ball was let down from the observation balloons and disappeared precisely at 12:10. This was done to let the troops know the exact time. Towards the end of the month, we marched to our old quarters in Gouy. After further battalion and brigade rehearsals, we twice practiced a breakthrough of the whole division over prepared ground with a whole trench system marked out. Finally, the general commanding the division addressed the officers in a way that left no doubt that the offensive was to be launched in a few days. The brazen spirit of the attack, the spirit of the Prussian infantry, swept through the massed troops assembled here in the opening spring of the soil of France to go through the ordeal of battle. If the aim the higher command had in view was not attained, it was certainly not the fault of the officers and the men. After 44 months of hard fighting, they threw themselves upon the enemy with all the enthusiasm of August 1914. No wonder it needed a world in arms to bring such a storm flood to a standstill. In the course of time, when the waves of hatred have subsided, history will recognize that we fought as no people ever fought before. It is a pleasure, too, to recall those evenings when we sat together around the table and talked, hot-headed, of the fresh frolic in front of us, the war of movement. Though our last coins went in wine, what need had we of money beyond the enemy's lines, or indeed, in a better beyond? Who knows but that the world, to ruin may be hurled, but if it is last today, today's enough. On the last evening, it needed Captain von Brixen's representation that the staff also had the right to exist, or else we should have smashed glasses, bottles, and crockery against the walls. The men, too, were in good form. It was enough to hear them talk of the coming event as the Hindenburg Flat Race, in their dry Lower Saxon way, to know that they would take hold as they always did, with an absolute reliability, and without a word too much. How could one be behindhand when these sons of the old oak-encircled homesteads went into battle? The gleam of many an ideal that shimmered for me over our war aims had been dashed to earth by war. One remains forever, this fidelity that cannot be shaken. On the 17th of March, towards dusk, we left the quarters we had now become very much attached to, and marched to Brunmont. All the roads were crowded with columns on the march, eagerly pressing forward, with countless guns and endless transport. Nevertheless, Everything went precisely according to plans worked out by the General Staff. Woe to any unit whose movements were not up to scheduled time. They were ruthlessly relegated to the ditch and had to wait hours before they found a gap into which they could squeeze. Once we were caught in the scrum, and Captain von Brixen's charger was pierced by an iron-tipped wagon pole and killed. The Great Offensive. The battalion was quartered in the chateau of Brunemont. We were told that we were to march up the line on the night of March 19th, 20th, and to occupy the dugouts in the line near Vrycourt, ready to go over the top on the morning of March 21st. The task assigned to the regiment was to break through between the villages of Vrycourt-Saint-Mine and Nouriel, which we knew from 1915 and 1916, on the first day. I sent Lieutenant Schmidt, who because of his amiability was never called anything but Little Schmidt, on ahead to make sure of our quarters. The regiment marched out of Brunemont at the appointed hour. Their morale was excellent in spite of the pouring rain. I overlooked a drunken fellow who reeled, bawling, between the files of my company, for now any harsh words could only do harm. Training was over, and now we came to business. Not a wheel of the machine was to be checked. Training was over, and now we came to business. Not a wheel of the machine was to be checked. From some crossroads where guides awaited us, the companies went forward independently. When we got as far as the second line, where we were to be quartered, it came out that the guides had lost their way. Now began a chase to and fro over the dim and sodden shell-hole area, and a questioning of innumerable troops, who knew as little about where they were as we did. To prevent the complete exhaustion of the men, I called a halt and sent out the guides in all directions. Sections piled arms and crowded into a gigantic crater, while I and Lieutenant Spranger sat on the edge of a smaller one. There had been single shells falling about 100 meters in front of us for some while. Then there was one nearer. The splinters struck the sides of the shell hole. One of the men cried out and said he was hit in the foot. I shouted to the men to scatter among the surrounding shell holes, and meanwhile I examined the man's boot to see if there was a hole. Then, the whistle of another shell high in the air. Everybody had that clutched feeling. It's coming over. There was a terrific, stupefying crash. The shell had burst in the midst of us. I picked myself up, half unconscious. The machine gun ammunition in the large shell hole, set alight by the explosion, was burning with an intense pink glow. It illuminated the rising fumes of the shell burst, in which there writhed a heap of black bodies, and the shadowy forms of the survivors, who were rushing from the scene in all directions. At the same time rose a multitudinous tumult of pain and cries for help. I will make no secret of it, that after a moment's blank horror, I took to my heels like the rest, and ran aimlessly into the night. It was not till I had fallen head over heels into a small shell hole that I understood what had happened. Only to hear and see no more. Only to get away, far away, and creep into a hole. And yet the other voice was heard. "You are the company commander, man!" Exactly so. I do not say it in self-praise. I might as well say, when God gives an office, he gives the understanding for it. I have often observed in myself and in others that an officer's sense of responsibility drowns his personal fears. There is a sticking place, something to occupy the thoughts. So I forced myself back into the ghastly spot. On the way I ran into Fusilier Haller, he who had bagged the machine gun on my November patrol, and took him along with me. The wounded men never ceased to utter their fearful cries. Some came creeping to me when they heard my voice and whimpered, "Sir! Sir!" One of my favorite recruits, Jasinski, whose leg was broken by a splinter, caught hold of me round the knees. Cursing my impotence to help, I vainly clapped him on the shoulder. Such moments can never be forgotten. I had to leave the wretched creatures to the one surviving stretcher-bearer, and lead the faithful few who remained and who collected round me, away from the fatal spot. Half an hour before, I had been at the head of a first-rate company at fighting strength. Now the few who followed me through the maze of the trenches where I lost my way were utterly crestfallen. A young lad, a milksop, who a few days before had been jeered at by his companions because during the training he had burst into tears over the weight of a box of ammunition, was now loyally hulking one along on our painful way after retrieving it from the scene of our disaster. When I saw that, I was finished. I threw myself on the ground and broke into convulsive sobs, while the men stood gloomily round me. After we had hastened on for hours, and to no purpose, and often menaced by shells, along the trench, ankle-deep in mud and water, we crept, dead tired, into some ammunition bays in the side of the trench. My batman spread his ground sheet over me, but the state of my nerves kept my eyes wide open, and thus, smoking cigars, I waited for daybreak. The first light of dawn revealed an utterly incredible sight. Countless troops, all over the shelled area, were still in search of their appointed shelter. Artillerymen were humping ammunition, trench mortarmen were pulling their mortars along, signalers were laying wires. There was a regular fair 1,000 meters in front of the enemy, who, incomprehensibly, appeared to observe nothing. By good luck, I ran across the commander of the 2nd Machine Gun Company, Lieutenant Fallenstein, an old front-line soldier, who was able to show me the way to our shelter. The first thing he said was, "What makes you look like that, man?" I led my men to a large, deep dugout that we had passed a dozen times during the night. There I found little Schmidt, who knew nothing of our disaster. The guides, also, were there. After that day, whenever we moved into a new position, I always chose the guides myself and with the greatest care. The lessons of war are thorough but costly. After settling in the men who had come with me, I went back to the horrible scene of the night before. It was a ghastly sight. In a ring round the burst were lying over 20 charred corpses, nearly all of them unrecognizably mutilated. Some, indeed, we had to report as missing, as nothing of them was to be found. I came on some soldiers of another unit, busied in extracting the blood-stained possessions of the dead out of the hideous mess, in the hope of booty. I chased the hyenas off, and told my orderly to collect the pocketbooks and valuables, as far as could be done, so that we could send them to their people. We had, in any case, to leave them behind when next morning we went over the top. I was delighted to see Lieutenant Springer come out of the dugout near me with a number of men who had spent the night there. I told the section leaders to report, and ascertained that I still disposed of 63 men. I had set out the night before, in the best of spirits, with 150. I succeeded in accounting for over 20 dead and over 60 wounded, some of whom died later from their injuries. The only grain of comfort was that it might have been worse. Fusilier Rust, for example, was standing so close to the burst that the carrying strap of his box began to burn. The NCO, Pagao, who it is true, was killed the next day, was standing between two men, both of whom were torn to bits, while he had not a scratch. We spent the day in poor spirits, sleeping mostly. I had to go again and again to the CO, as there was always something to do with the attacks to arrange. Apart from this, I lay on a bunk talking to my two officers about trifling matters, in order to escape the torture of our thoughts. The constant refrain was, "Thank God we can only die once." I said a few words to the men, who crouched together in silence on the steps, with a view to cheer them up, but it seemed to have little effect. Nor was I myself in an encouraging mood. At 10 o'clock in the evening, a runner brought orders to move into the first line. A wild beast dragged from its lair, or a sailor who sees the last plank swept from his grasp, may, perhaps, have feelings comparable to ours when we were compelled to leave the warmth and safety of the dugout. Yet, not one of them was tempted to stay behind unobserved. We hurried along the Felix trench under sharp shrapnel fire and got through without a casualty. While we passed along the trench below, guns crossed by bridges over our heads to take up forward positions. The section of the trench allotted to the battalion was quite narrow. Every dugout was filled with troops in a moment. The rest had to dig themselves holes in the sides of the trench, so as to have some shelter at least during the bombardment preceding the attack. At last, after much scrambling to and fro, everyone had found his hole. Once more, Captain von Brixen assembled the company commanders for his last remarks. When we had synchronized watches for the last time, we shook hands and separated. I sat down on the steps of a dugout with my two officers to wait for 5:5 a.m., the moment when the artillery preparation was to begin. The atmosphere was slightly more cheerful, as the rain had left off and the clear, starry sky promised a fine morning. We passed the time eating and talking. Everyone smoked hard, and the water bottles went round. In the early hours, the enemy artillery was so lively that we were afraid the English had smelt a rat. Just before 0, the following flash signal was given to us. HM, the Kaiser and Hindenburg are on the scene of operations. It was greeted with enthusiasm. The hands crept on. We counted the last minutes as they marked them off. At last, they stood at 5:5. At once, the hurricane broke loose. A curtain of flames was let down, followed by a sudden impetuous tumult such as we had never heard, a raging thunder that swallowed up the reports even of the heaviest guns and its tremendous reverberations, and made the earth tremble. This gigantic roar of annihilation from countless guns behind us was so terrific that, compared with it, all preceding battles were child's play. What we had not dared to hope came true. The enemy artillery was silenced, put out of action by one giant blow. We could not stay any longer in the dugouts. We got out onto the top and looked with wonder at the wall of fire towering over the English lines and the swaying blood-red clouds that hung over it. Our delight was lessened by the tears and the burning of the mucous membrane caused by the fumes of our own gas shells that the wind blew back on us. Many of the men were forced to pull off their masks when the unpleasant effects of our Blue Cross gas threw them into fits of choking and coughing. I felt very uneasy, yet I felt sure that our command could not have made a miscalculation from which our destruction would necessarily follow. Meanwhile, I exerted all my energy to keep the first cough back, so as not to increase the irritation. After an hour, we were able to take off our masks. It was now daylight. The terrific tumult behind us rose higher and higher. In front stood a blind wall of smoke, dust, and gas. Men were rerunning along the trench and shouting delightedly into each other's ears. Infantry and artillery, engineers and signalers, Prussians and Bavarians, officers and men, were all alike in transports over this elemental expression of German power, and were burning with impatience for 9:40 when we were to advance to the attack. At 8:45, our heavy trench mortars, that stood almost touching one another behind the front line, started up. We could see the great 200-weight bombs fly in a steep trajectory through the air and fall to the earth on the other side with Hephaestian explosions. Their bursts made a close chain of craters and eruption. The very laws of nature seemed to have lost their validity. The air shimmered as though on a day of summer heat. The changing index of refraction made fixed objects dance to and fro. Black streaks of shadow flitted across the mass of smoke. The roar had become a norm, and one heard no longer. One could scarcely hear the thousands of machine guns in our rear that swept the blue sky with swarm upon swarm of lead. The last hour of the artillery preparation was unhealthier than all the 4 preceding ones, during which he had walked about unheeding on the top. The enemy brought a heavy battery into action that landed shell after shell into our crowded trench. I went to the left to avoid them, and ran into the adjutant, Lieutenant Hines, who asked me if I had seen Lieutenant Baron von Solmacher. "You must take over the battalion at once! Captain von Brixen has just been killed!" I was shocked at this bad news, and went back and sat in a deep burrow in the earth. By the time I left there, I had utterly forgotten the news I had heard. My brain had only one link with reality. 9:40. It seemed, though, that I was behaving courageously, for everybody smiled approvingly when they looked at me. The NCO Jusefskin, a comrade of the Regneville patrol, came to a stop in front of my burrow and asked me to come out into the trench, as even a light shell bursting anywhere near might precipitate the whole mass of soil on my head. An explosion took the very words from his mouth. He fell to the ground with a leg torn off. I sprang over him and fled to the right, where I crept to earth again in a hole already occupied by 2 engineers. The heavy shells were falling in a narrow circle all around us. Suddenly, from a white cloud hurtled black lumps of soil. As for the detonation, it was lost in the general roar. Indeed, the sense of hearing was lost. In the piece of trench near us to our left, 3 men of my company were torn to pieces. One of the last hits, a dud, killed poor little Schmidt, who had not left the dugout steps. I was standing with Springer, with my watch in my hand, in front of my burrow, and waiting for the great moment. The rest of the company had collected around us. By jokes of coarseness that unfortunately prevents me from setting it down here, we succeeded in cheering and distracting them. Lieutenant Meyer, who peeped for a moment round the traverse, told me later that he thought us out of our minds. The officer patrols who were to cover our advance left the trench at 9:10. As our front line and the enemy's were here 800 meters apart, we had to move forward even during the artillery preparation and to take up our position in no man's land in readiness to jump into the enemy's front line at 9:40. Springer and I climbed out onto the top after a few minutes, followed by the men. "Now we'll show what the 7th Company can do. I don't care for anything now. Vengeance for the 7th Company! Vengeance for Captain von Brixen!" We drew our revolvers and crossed our wire, through which the first casualties were already trailing back. I looked to the left and right. The distribution of the host presented a strange spectacle. In shell holes in front of the enemy lines, churned and churned again by the utmost pitch of shell fire. The attacking battalions were waiting massed in companies, as far as the eye could see. When I saw this massed might piled up, the breakthrough seemed to me a certainty. But was there strength in us to smash the enemy's reserves and hurl them to destruction? I was confident of it. The decisive battle, the final advance, had begun. The destiny of the nations drew to its iron conclusion, and the stake was the possession of the world. I was conscious, if only in feeling, of the significance of that hour, and I believe that on this occasion every man felt his personality fade away in the face of a crisis in which he had his part to play, and by which history would be made. No one who has lived through moments like these can doubt that the course of nations in the last resort rises and falls with the destiny of war. The atmosphere of intense excitement was amazing. Officers stood upright and shouted chaff nervously to each other. Often a heavy trench mortar fired short and scattered us with its fountains of earth, and no one even bent his head. The roar of battle had become so terrific that we were scarcely in our right senses. The nerves could register fear no longer. Everyone was mad and beyond reckoning. We had gone over the edge of the world into superhuman perspectives. Death had lost its meaning, and the will to live was made over to our country, and hence everyone was blind and regardless of his personal fate. 3 minutes before the attack, my batman, the faithful Vrycourt, beckoned to me, pointing to a full water bottle. He recognized, in his own way, the need of the hour. I took a long pull. It was as though I drank water. There was only the cigar wanting the usual one for such occasions. 3 times, the match was blown out by the commotion of the air. The great moment had come. The fire lifted over the first trenches. We advanced. The turmoil of our feelings was called forth by rage, alcohol, and the thirst for blood as we stepped out, heavily and yet irresistibly, for the enemy's lines. And therewith beat the pulse of heroism, the godlike and the bestial inextricably mingled. I was far in front of the company, followed by my batman and a man of 1 year's service called Hack. In my right hand I gripped my revolver, in my left a bamboo riding cane. I was boiling with a fury now utterly inconceivable to me. The overpowering desire to kill winged my feet. Rage squeezed bitter tears from my eyes. The tremendous force of destruction that bent over the field of battle was concentrated in our brains. So may men of the Renaissance have been locked in their passions. So may a Cellini have raged, or werewolves have howled and hunted through the nights on the track of blood. We crossed a battered tangle of wire without difficulty, and at a jump were over the front line, scarcely recognizable any longer. The attacking waves of infantry bobbed up and down in ghostly lines in the white rolling smoke. Against all expectation, a machine gun rattled at us from the second line. I and the men with me jumped for a shell hole. A second later, there was a frightful crack, and I sank forward in a heap. Vrycourt caught me round the neck and turned me on my back. "Are you hit, sir?" There was nothing to be seen. The 1 year's service fellow had a hole through his arm, and assured us, groaning, that he had a bullet in his back. We pulled off his uniform and bound him up. The churned-up earth showed us that a shrapnel shell had burst at the level of our faces on the edge of the shell hole. It was a wonder we were still alive. Meanwhile, the others were on beyond us. We scrambled after them, leaving the wounded man to his fate, after we had stuck a bit of wood in the ground near him with a strip of white muslin as a mark for the wave of stretcher-bearers that were following the fighting troops. Half left of us, the great railway embankment and the line Acoist Crucelis, which we had to cross, rose out of the mist. From loopholes in dugout windows built into the side of it, rifles and machine guns were rattling merrily. Even Vinke had disappeared. I followed a sunken road, with its smashed-in shelters yawning in its banks. I strode on in a fury over the black and torn-up ground, from which rose the suffocating gas of our shells. I was entirely alone. Then I caught sight of the first of the enemy. A figure crouched, wounded apparently, 3 meters in front of me in the middle of a pounded hollow of the road. I saw him start at the sight of me, and stare at me with wide-open eyes as I walked slowly up to him, holding out my revolver in front of me. A drama without an audience was ready. To me, the mere sight of an enemy in tangible form was a release. Grinding my teeth, I pressed the muzzle to the temple of this wretch, whom terror now crippled, and with my other hand gripped hold of his tunic. With a beseeching cry, he snatched a photograph from his pocket and held it before my eyes. Himself, surrounded by a numerous family. I forced down my mad rage and walked past. Men of my company came jumping down into the sunken road. We were aglow with heat. I pulled off my cloak and threw it away. I still remember that I shouted very empathetically, and more than once. Lieutenant Younger now casts off his cloak, and made at that the Fusiliers laughed as though I had made the most priceless joke. Above us, everyone was going for it over the top without the least regard for the machine guns, which were at the utmost 400 meters away from us. The same impulse of annihilation drew me into the sheaves of fire. I ran straight for the embankment, spit bullets as it might. In a shell hole I came upon a figure in a brown waterproof, shooting with a revolver. It was Kyus, who was in a like mood, and stuffed a handful of cartridges in my pocket by way of greeting. We must have spent a long while running to and fro among the shell holes, and engaged one target after another. In any case, I found myself at last at the foot of the embankment, and I saw a dugout window quite close to me covered with a sandbag, from which I could see they were firing. I shot through the cloth. A man near me tore it down and threw in a bomb. A shock, and a cloud of smoke welling out showed the result. 2 ran along the bank, and dealt with the other loopholes in the same way. I raised my hand to warn the men behind, for their bullets at very short range were whistling past our ears. They nodded back, delighted. After that, we clambered with hundreds more, and at once rushed up the bank. For the first time in the war, I saw large bodies of men in hand-to-hand fighting. The English held 2 terraced trenches on the rear slope. Shots were exchanged, and bombs lobbed down in a range of a few meters. I jumped into the first trench. Stumbling round the first traverse, I collided with an English officer with an open tunic and his tie hanging loose. I did without my revolver, and seizing him by the throat, flung him against the sandbags, where he collapsed. Behind me, the head of an old major appeared. He was shouting to me, "Shoot the hound dead!" I left this to those behind me and turned to the lower trenches. It seethed with English. I fired off my cartridges so fiercely that I pressed the trigger 10 times at least after the last shot. A man next to me threw bombs among them as they scrambled to get away. A dish-shaped helmet was sent spinning high in the air. A minute saw the battle ended. The English jumped out of their trenches and fled by battalions across the open. They stumbled over each other as they fled, and in a few seconds the ground was strewn with dead. Only a few got away. An NCO was standing near me, gaping at this spectacle with mouth agog. I snatched the rifle from his hands in an uncomfortable need to shoot. My first victim was an Englishman, whom I shot between two Germans at 150 meters. He snapped together like the blade of a knife and lay still. After quite a time had been spent thus, we went on. The spirit of the attack had been kindled by success to a white heat of recklessness in every man. There was no question of leading the several units. Nevertheless, one cry was on everybody's lips. On! Every man went straight ahead. As my objective, I chose a little hill where the ruins of a cottage, the cross on a grave, and the wreckage of an aeroplane were to be seen. I went forward so blindly that I got into the zone of our own fire, and had to throw myself into a shell hole for cover while waiting for the guns to lengthen their range. I found a young officer of another regiment close to me who, quite like myself, was rejoicing over the success of our first assault. The common enthusiasm brought us as close in those few moments as if we had known each other for years. The next spring forward parted us, never to meet again. Even during those frightful moments, something ludicrous occurred. A man near me whipped his rifle to his shoulder, as though he were out shooting, to shoot a hare that suddenly jumped up and ran through our lines. The episode was so bewildering that I had to laugh. There indeed can be nothing so horrible that some crazy fellow cannot cap it. Near the ruins of the house lay a small length of trench which was being raked by machine gun fire from the far side. I jumped in it at one bound, and found it unoccupied. Immediately after, Kuss and Wedelstadt appeared. An orderly of Wedelstadt's, who came last, collapsed in mid-jump and lay dead, shot through the eye. When Wedelstadt saw this last man of his company fall headlong, he leant his head on the edge of the trench and wept. And neither was he destined to survive this day. Below us lay a strongly held position in a sunken road. In front of it were two machine gun nests, one on each edge of a hollow. The turmoil of our gunfire had rolled on over this strong point, and the enemy seemed to have recovered. At any rate, he was pouring out lead as fast as it would leave the barrels. We were separated by a strip of ground 500 meters wide, and across it the sheaths of fire buzzed like swarms of bees. After a pause for breath, we went on over the top at the enemy with a handful of men. It was a fight to the death. After one or two springs forward, I lay opposite the left-hand machine gun position, alone but for one man. I could clearly distinguish a flat helmet beside a low mound of earth, and close beside it, a thin spiral of steam. I approached in quite short springs so as to allow no chance for aim. Each time that I lay down, the man threw me a clip of cartridges and I fired a few carefully aimed shots. "Cartridges! Cartridges!" I turned round and saw him lying twitching on one side. When I look back now to that blind dash across the open against a choice and well-furnished position, I see that we must have been inspired by quite an improbable degree of recklessness. And yet, where would be the successive war if it were not for individuals whom the thrill of action intoxicates and hurls forward with an impetus not to be resisted? It seemed often as though death itself feared to cross our path. From the left, where the resistance was weaker, there appeared a few men who were almost in a position to bomb the post. I set out on my last spring forward and stumbled over a barbed wire entanglement into the trench. The English left their guns and ran, fired on from all sides, and made their escape to the nest on the right. The machine gun was half concealed beneath a huge heap of empty drums. It was still nearly red-hot, smoking. The corpse of an athlete lay in front of it. A shot through the head had put out one eye, and I could claim the shot as mine. The enormous fellow, with his great white eyeball, and his smoke-blackened skull looked terrible. I was perishing of thirst, and, unable to bear it any longer, I began to look for water. The entrance of a deep dugout seemed promising. I peered in and saw a man sitting at the bottom, mending an ammunition belt on his knee. Instead of going for him at once, as in prudence I ought, I called out to him, "Come here! Hands up!" He jumped up, staring at me in amazement, and disappeared into the darkness. I threw a bomb after him. Presumably the dugout had a second entrance, for a man came from behind a traverse and said laconically, "We've just shot them. They're done for." At last, I came to a tin can full of cooling water. I poured the oily fluid down in huge gulps, filled an English water bottle, and gave some to the others who suddenly crowded into the trench. Meanwhile, from the right-hand machine gun nest, and also from the sunken road 60 meters in front of us, there was still a resolute resistance. The fellows put up a superb show. We tried to turn the English machine gun on them, but we had no success with it. On the contrary, while I was busy with it, a bullet flew by my head, grazed a Jaeger lieutenant standing behind me, and wounded a man severely in the shoulder. A light machine gun section had better luck. They got their gun mounted on the edge of our little crescent-shaped trench and raked the English from the flank. There was a moment of surprise, and it was turned to good account by the assaulting troops on our right. They charged the sunken road from the front, with our 9th Company, still intact, led by Lieutenant Gipkins at the head. And now from every shell hole figures rose, and with a terrific hurrah, brandishing their rifles, rolling their eyes, foam on their lips, they rushed upon the enemy's position, out of which the defenders advanced by hundreds, with their hands held high. No quarter was given. The English hastened with upstretched arms through the first wave of storm troops to the rear, where the fury of the battle had not reached boiling point. An orderly of Gipkins shot a good dozen or more of them with his .32 repeater. I could not blame our men for their bloodthirsty conduct. To kill a defenseless man is a baseness. Nothing in the war was more repulsive to me than those heroes of the mess tables, who used to repeat with a fat laugh the familiar tale of the prisoners marched in. "Did you hear about that massacre? Priceless." On the other hand, the defending force, after driving their bullets into the attacking one at 5 paces distance, must take the consequences. A man cannot change his feelings again during the last rush with a veil of blood before his eyes. He does not want to take prisoners, but to kill. He has no scruples left. Only the spell of primeval instinct remains. It is not till the blood has flowed that the mist gives way in his soul. He looks round him as though waking from the bondage of a dream. It is only then that he becomes once more a soldier of today, and capable of addressing himself to the next problem of tactics. This was the state we found ourselves in after the capture of the sunken road. A large body of the men had collected and stood in a mob, shouting confusedly. Some officers pointed out to them the continuation of the hollow ground, and the great battle horde, with astonishing coolness, lumbered on. The hollow ran up into higher ground, and from there enemy columns were coming into sight. We advanced, now and then standing still to shoot, till we were held up by heavy rifle fire. It was extremely painful to hear the bullets striking the ground near your head. Kyus, who had come up again, picked up a flattened one that had been stopped half a meter in front of his nose. Making use of a brief pause, we got to a shell hole. They had already become rare. We found a number of officers of our battalion there. It was commanded now by Lieutenant Lindenberg, for Baron von Solmacher had unfortunately been mortally wounded during the assault on the embankment. On the right side of the hollow, Lieutenant Breyer, attached to us from the 10th Jaegers, was strolling along the machine gun fire to the delight of everyone, with a walking stick in his hand and a long green huntsman's pipe in his mouth, and his rifle on his shoulder as if he were out shooting hares. We told each other briefly of our adventures so far, and handed round water bottles and chocolate. And then, the general wish was to go on again. The machine guns, threatened apparently on the flank, had disappeared. We might perhaps have won 3 or 4 kilometers. The hollow was seething with the attacking troops. As far as the eye could see behind us, there were men coming on in open order, ranks and columns. We were unfortunately much too thick on the ground, and it was just as well we did not know in the heat of the attack how many were left behind, either dead or wounded. We reached the high ground without opposition. A few khaki figures jumped from a piece of trench on our right, and we shot them down out of hand as they ran. Most of them were accounted for. The top of the hill was held by a row of dugouts. From them smoke was rising, and of these we made short work with bombs. From others the occupants emerged with arms uplifted and knocking knees. Water bottles and cigarettes were taken from them, and as soon as the way to the rear was pointed out, they hurried off with great speed. One young Englishman already surrendered to me, and then suddenly turning round, he disappeared into this dugout. As he stayed in concealment in spite of my summons to come out, we made an end of his indecision with a bomb and went on. A narrow footpath went off down the other side of the hill. A signpost showed that it led to Vrycourt. While the other side still delayed in the dugouts, Heinz and I went over the top of the hill. Down below lay the ruins of Vrycourt. The flashes of a battery in action were to be seen in front, but the detachments fled into the village at the sight of the first wave of storm troops. The occupants, too, of a number of dugouts built in the side of the sunken road, rushed out and fled. I shot one of them as he jumped out of the entrance of the nearest. With 2 men of the company who reported to me meanwhile, I went along the sunken road. There was a defended position to the right of it, from which came a heavy fire. So we withdrew into the first dugout, over which very soon the shots of both sides were crossing. My Englishman lay in front of it, a mere lad. I had shot him right through the head. It is a strange feeling to look into the eyes of a man whom you have killed with your own hands. We did not worry over the increasing fire, but established ourselves in the dugout and looked through the provisions left behind, as our stomachs reminded us that we had eaten nothing during the attack. We found here white bread, jam, and a stone jar full of ginger beer. After refreshing myself, I sat on an empty biscuit tin and read some English newspapers that abounded in the most tasteless invective against the Huns. After a while, we became tired of doing nothing, so we went back to the beginning of the sunken road and jumps, and there found a large body of men assembled. Thence we could see a battalion of the 164th near Vrycourt. We decided to storm the village, and hurried forward again along the sunken road. A little way before the edge of the village, we were brought to a stop by our own artillery, which had the stupidity to go on shooting the same spot till next day. A heavy shell landed among us when we were halfway, and killed 4 men. The others turned and ran. As I learned later, the artillery had orders to go on shooting at their longest range. This incomprehensible order took the finest fruits of victory from our grasp. Grinding our teeth with rage, we had to make a halt before the wall of fire. In the hope of finding a gap in it, we turned away to the right, where at that moment a company commander of the 76 was leading an attack on the Vrycourt line. We joined in with a cheer, but had scarcely got a footing in it before our own artillery shelled us out again. We stormed the trench 3 times, and 3 times had to retire again. Curse as we might, we could only occupy some shell holes, and there a grass fire started by our own artillery destroyed many wounded, and caused us intolerable discomfort. The English rifle fire, too, caused casualties, among whom was the volunteer, Grutzmacher, of my company. Darkness came slowly on. Sporadically, the rifle fire blazed out in a final burst, and then was silent all along our front. The men, utterly exhausted, looked round for shelter for the night, and the officers called their own names without ceasing in order to assemble the scattered companies. 12 men of the 7th Company had collected round me during the last hour. As it was growing cold, I led them to the little dugout in front of which my Englishmen lay, and sent them out to collect blankets and cloaks from the fallen. When I got them all settled down, I could no longer resist the curiosity I had to visit the gun pit lying in front of us. I took Fusilier Haller with me, as I had the utmost confidence in his sporting spirit. We walked on with our rifles at the ready towards the pit, over which our artillery fire raged without ceasing, and next explored a dugout that had apparently been recently abandoned by English artillery officers. There was an enormous gramophone on the table that Haller at once set going. The gay, musical comedy song that whirred from the disc made a ghostly impression, and I threw the box to the ground, where after a wheeze and a gasp it lay still. The dugout was furnished with extreme comfort, even to a little open grate, and a mantelpiece, on which lay pipes and tobacco, with a circle of armchairs round the fire. Merry old England. Naturally, we took without compunction whatever we liked. I chose a haversack, underclothes, a little silver flask full of whiskey, a map case, and some of the most charming toilet articles by Roger et Gallet, no doubt tender recollections of a Paris leave. A neighboring room served as the kitchen, whose array of provisions filled us with respectful admiration. There was a whole box full of fresh eggs. We sucked down a large number on the spot, as we had long since forgotten their very name. Against the walls were stacks of tinned meat, cases of priceless thick jam, bottles of coffee essence as well, and quantities of tomatoes and onions. In short, all that a gourmet could desire. This sight I often remembered later, when we spent weeks together in the trenches on a rigid allowance of bread, washy soup, and thin jam. For 4 long years, in torn coats and worse fed than a Chinese coolie, the German soldier was hurried from one battlefield to the next to show his iron fist yet again to a foe many times his superior in numbers, well equipped and well fed. There could be no surer sign of the might of the idea that drove us on. It is easy to face death and to die in the moment of enthusiasm. To hunger and starve for one's cause is more. After this glimpse into the enemy's domestic circumstances, we left the dugout and went into the gun pit, where we found that 2 brand new guns had been abandoned. I took a lump of chalk and chalked up the number of my company. I may observe that the right of capture was very little respected by the troops that followed after. Each unit obliterated the mark of its predecessor and put its own, till that of some labor battalion survived. This shows how very rudimentary the sporting instinct is among the people. We returned to the others, as our own guns were throwing metal about our ears all the time. Our front line, dug in the meanwhile by the troops behind us, was 200 meters in our rear. I posted 2 men in front of the dugout, and gave orders for the others of the guard to keep hold of their rifles. After I had arranged the reliefs, had a little more to eat, and made a note of the events of the day, I went to sleep. At 1 we were awakened by shouts and lively rifle fire from our right. We seized our rifles and, rushing outside, posted ourselves in a large shell hole. A few scattered Germans came back from in front of us and were fired on from our own lines. 2 of them fell. Put on our guard by this, we waited till the excitement subsided behind us, and calling out to show who we were, we retired to our own lines. There we found the commander of the 2nd Company, speechless with a cold and wounded in the arm, with about 60 men of our regiment. As he had to go back to a dressing station, I took command of his detachment, among which were 3 officers. Besides this, there were the 2 companies of Gipkins and Vorbeck, jumbled up like the rest. The commanding officer of the battalion was Captain Baron von Lebedeur, and of the regiment, Major Dietlein, as Major von Bartleben had been wounded early in the day. I spent the rest of the night with some NCOs of the 2nd Company in a little hole in the ground, where we were stiff with cold. I breakfasted in the morning from the plundered provisions, and sent a party to Quant to fetch coffee and rations. Our own artillery began again with its cursed shelling, and as a morning greeting, sent us a direct hit in a shell hole which accommodated 4 men of the machine gun company. At dawn, the platoon commander of my company, Vice Sergeant Major Cumpart, turned up with a few men. I had scarcely got my circulation going again after the cold of the night, when I had orders to storm the Vrycourt line further to the right, taking with me what there was of the 76th Regiment as well. This line on our front was already partly in our hands. There was a thick morning mist as we moved off to the jumping-off position, a hill to the south of Vrycourt, where many dead of the day before were lying. As is usual when the orders for an attack are somewhat vague, there was a tremendous palaver among the officers of the storm troops, which nothing but the play of an enemy machine gun was able to bring to an end. Everybody jumped for the nearest shell hole with the exception of the sergeant major, Cumpart, who lay groaning. I hurried to him with a stretcher bearer and bound him up. He was badly wounded in the knee. We extracted several pieces of bone from the wound with a forceps. He died a few days later. I felt it particularly, as he had been my drill instructor 3 years before in recouvrance. I exposed the folly of a frontal attack in a discussion with Captain von Lebedeur, since it was clear that the Vrycourt line, already partly in our hands, could with far less loss be rolled up from the left. We decided not to carry out an attack, and events proved us right. Such episodes proved the futility of the system of higher command with its headquarters far in the rear, though of course I do not question the necessity. At the same time, such an order clearly shows a lack of experience of frontline fighting. The time for frontal attacks without preparation has forever gone by. The common soldier who has been taught his lesson by the enemy's rifles could not fall into such a blunder. It succeeded only where the enemy was weak. The strong parts of the line then fell of themselves. For the time being, we established ourselves in the shell holes on the higher ground. The sun came through by degrees, and English aeroplanes appeared, which sprayed our refuges with machine guns, but were soon driven off. Below Vrycourt we saw a battery drive up, an unusual sight for old trench soldiers. It, too, was soon shelled. 1 horse only tore itself free and galloped over the field. It was an uncanny sight, this panic-stricken beast against the wide and deserted stretches of country hung with the drifting smoke of the bursting shells. The enemy flyers had not been long gone before we began to be shelled. At first a few shrapnels broke over us, then light and heavy shells in plenty. We lay as though on a silver salver. Several unquiet spirits drew worse fire by losing their heads and running to and fro, instead of lying low in their shell holes and letting the stuff sweep over their heads. In such situations, one must be a fatalist. I took this text to heart as I consumed the really glorious contents of a tin of gooseberry jam that I had carried off as booty. In this fashion, the morning slowly drew to an end. We observed movement for some time past on our left in the Vrycourt line. Now, we saw straight in front of us the curved flight and the white bursts of German stick bombs. This was the moment we waited for. I gave the word to advance. We reached the enemy line without encountering much fire, and jumped in, eagerly welcomed by a storm troop of the 76th Regiment. Headway was slowly made, bombing along the trench, as at Cambrai. The enemy artillery soon found out, unfortunately, that we were obstinately eating into their lines. We were pretty sharply shelled with shrapnel and light shells, but the reserves who were streaming up to the trench over the Oppen caught the worst of it. We did our utmost to clear the trench of the enemy, so that we could take cover from the artillery fire. The Vrycourt line was still in course of digging, and many stretches of it were only marked out by the removal of turf. When we rushed these pieces, we had all the fire in the neighborhood concentrated on us. In the same way, we had the enemy under fire when they crossed these spots, as they gave way before us, so that these short stretches of ground were soon heaped with corpses. It was a nerve-scourging spot. We dashed over the still warm, muscular bodies, displaying powerful knees below their kilts, or crept on over them. They were Highlanders, and the resistance we were meeting showed we had no cowards in front of us. After we had gained a few hundred meters in this fashion, we were brought to a halt by the bombs and rifle grenades that fell more and more thickly. The men began to give way. "Tommy's counterattacking! Blues stan! I'll just see that we're in touch. Bombs forward! Bombs forward! Look out, sir!" It is just in trench fighting, the fiercest fighting of all, that such recoils are most frequent. The bravest push to the front, shooting and bomb throwing. The rest follow on their heels automatically, in a herd. In the hand-to-hand battle, the fighters jump back and forward, and in avoiding the murderous bombs of the enemy, they run back on those behind them. Only those in the forefront know what the situation is, while further back a wild panic breaks out in the crowded trench. Perhaps a few even jump out over the top and get shot, whereat the enemy of course are much encouraged. Indeed, if they seize their opportunity, all is lost, and it is now for the officer to show that he is worth his salt, though he may too have the wind-up. I succeeded in getting together a handful of men, and with them I organized a nucleus of resistance behind a broad traverse. We exchanged missiles with an invisible opponent at a few meters' distance. It took some courage to hold your head up when they burst and whipped up the heaped soil of the traverse. A man of the 76, close to me, shot off cartridge after cartridge, looking perfectly wild and without a thought of cover, till he collapsed in streams of blood. A shot had smashed his forehead with a report like a breaking board. He doubled up in the corner of his trench, and there he remained in a crouching attitude, his head leaning against the side. His blood poured on the ground as though poured out of a bucket. The snorting death rattles sounded at longer intervals and at last ceased. I seized his rifle and went on firing. At last, there was a brief pause. Two men who were in front of us made an attempt to dash back over the top. One fell into the trench, shot through the head. The other, shot through the body, could only creep after him. We sat in the bottom of the trench and waited and smoked English cigarettes. Now and then, a well-aimed rifle grenade came arrowing over. The man shot in the belly was a young lad, and he lay between us and almost contentedly stretched himself like a cat in the warm rays of the setting sun. He slipped over to death, smiling like a child. It was a sight that had nothing sad or painful in it. I was touched by nothing but a clear feeling of affection for the dying man. The groaning, too, of his comrade gradually ceased. He died where he lay, after fits of shuddering. We tried several times to work our way forward by crawling flattened out over the bodies of the Highlanders across the undug part, but we were driven back every time by machine gun fire and rifle grenades. Every casualty I saw was a fatal one. In this way, the forward part of our trench was gradually filled with dead, and in turn we were constantly reinforced from the rear. Soon there was a light or heavy machine gun behind every traverse. I stood behind one of these lead squirts and shot till my forefinger was blackened with smoke. When the cooling water had evaporated, the tins were handed round, and to the accompaniment of not very polite jokes, and by a very simple expedient, filled up again. In anxious moments, we must bring ourselves to much that's not the thing. The sun was far down in the sky. It seemed that the second day of battle was over. For the first time, I took a careful look round, and sent back a report and sketch map, overtaken once more by the thought, you are not a fighter only, but a soldier. The trench we were in cut the Vrycourt Morey road at a distance of 500 meters in front of us. The road was camouflaged by hangings fastened to the trees. Enemy troops were hurrying over the slope of a hill behind, shells bursting round them. Streamers of black and white and red crossed the cloudless blue of the evening sky. The beams of sunset dipped them in a tender rosy red, so that they resembled a flight of flamingos. We unfolded our trench maps and spread them out to see how far we had penetrated enemy lines. A cool evening breeze promised a sharp night. Wrapped in an English trench coat, I leaned against the side of the trench and talked to little Schultz, the comrade of my Indian patrols, who, like a good friend, had turned up with 4 heavy machine guns just where there was most need for them. Men of all companies sat on the fire steps. Their features were youthful and clear-cut beneath their steel helmets. Their leaders had fallen, and it was of their own impulse that they were here and in their right place. We set about putting ourselves in a state of defense for the night. I put my revolver and a dozen English bombs beside me, and felt ready for all comers, even though they were the most pig-headed of Scotsmen. Then there came a new outbreak of bombing from the right, and on the left, German light signals went up. From somewhere, a faint hurrah came on the wind. That roused us. They're surrounded! They're surrounded! In one of those moments of enthusiasm that heralds great exploits, everyone seized his rifle and rushed forward along the trench. After a short encounter with bombs, a body of Highlanders made hurriedly for the road. There was no holding us now. In spite of warning shouts, "Look out! The machine gun on the left is still firing!" We jumped out of the trench and in an instant reached the road, where there was a stampede of Highlanders. A long, thick wire entanglement cut off their retreat, so that like hunted game they had to run past us at 50 meters distance. On our side, there broke out a tumultuous hurrah that must have struck their ears like the trumpet of the Last Judgment, and a hurricane of rapid fire. Machine guns mounted in haste made a massacre of it. While I was cursing at a jam that prevented me firing, I felt a blow on the shoulder. I turned round and saw the face of little Schultz, distorted with rage. "Look! They're still firing! The cursed swine!" I looked where he pointed, and saw a row of men in a little trench across the road, some loading, some shooting. In a moment, though, the first bombs were thrown from the right, and the whole trunk of one of them was flung in the air. Reason bade me to stay where I was while we finished off the enemy at our leisure with a few rounds. Instead of this, I threw away my rifle and rushed with clenched fists onto the road between the two sides. Unluckily, I was still wearing the English coat and my cap with a red band. In the very transport of victory, I felt a sharp blow on the left side of my breast. Night descended on me. I was finished. I was convinced I was shot through the heart, yet I felt neither pain nor fear as I awaited my immediate death. When I found to my astonishment that I had not fallen, and discovered no hole in my shirt either, I turned on the enemy again. At that, a man of my company rushed up. "Sir, take off that coat!" and snatched the dangerous garment from my shoulders. Another hurrah rent the air. From the right, where ever since the morning bombing had been going on, a number of Germans sprang over the road to our help, with a young officer in a brown waterproof at their head. It was Kuss. By good luck, he tripped over a low entanglement just as our English machine gun fired its last shots, and the stream of bullets flew by over his head. The Scottish were annihilated in a few furious moments by rifle fire and bombs. The road was strewn with dead, and what few survived were followed by our fire. When I was standing talking to Kuss in the captured trench, I felt a moist feeling in my breast. Tearing open my shirt, I saw that I had been hit just over the heart. The bullet had gone through me just above my iron cross, leaving 2 holes in my body and 2 in my shirt. There was no doubt that I had been shot for an Englishman by one of our own men. I strongly suspect the one who had torn off my coat, at the range of a few paces. Kuss bound me up, and with great difficulty induced me to leave the battlefield at this interesting moment. We parted with, "See you in Hanover." I chose myself an escort, looked for my map case, as it contained my diary, on the fire-swept road, and went back through the trench that we had fought our way along. Our battle cries had been so powerful that the enemy artillery had broken out at once. Over all the ground beyond the trench, and particularly on the trench itself, lay a barrage of unusual intensity. It was scarcely likely we could get safely through it. We went in jumps from traverse to traverse. Suddenly, there was a shattering crash on the edge of the trench close by me. I felt a blow on the back of my head and fell forward, stunned. When I came to, I was hanging with my head down over the breech of a heavy machine gun and staring into a pool of blood that grew larger at an alarming rate. The blood poured so fast that I gave up all hope of survival. As my escort, however, assured me that nothing of my brain was to be seen, I picked myself up and went on. I had paid the penalty for my folly in going into an attack without a helmet. In spite of the double loss of blood, I was in great excitement, and implored everyone we met in the trench, as though possessed by one idea, to hurry forward and join the fight. We were soon beyond the zone of the light field guns and slackened our pace, as only a bird of ill omen need expect to be hit by an isolated heavy. In the sunken road leading from Noriel, I passed brigade headquarters, and reported to Major General Hobel, whom I had already informed of our success, and begged him to send reserves to support the attacking force. The general told me that I had been killed the day before. It was not the first time in the war. In Noriel, a great pile of boxes and bombs was burning merrily by the roadside. We hurried past with very mixed feelings. Beyond the villages, I got a lift in an empty ammunition wagon. I had a sharp encounter with the officer commanding the ammunition column, who wanted to have 2 wounded Englishmen who had helped me along over the last part of the way thrown off the wagon. The traffic on the Noriel-Quant road was amazing. No one who has not seen it can form any idea of the endless columns of troops that go to make an offensive. Beyond Quant, the throng was incredible. It was a sad sight when I passed the little college of Jean d'Arc. Nothing but the foundation was left. I went up to an officer with a white armband, denoting that he was in control of the traffic, and he procured me a seat in a private car as far as the field hospital at Souchez-Cochet. We often had to wait half an hour when wagons and lorries got mixed up and blocked the road. The doctors in the operating theater of the field hospital were feverishly busy. Nevertheless, the surgeon who attended me could not repress his astonishment at the fortunate nature of my wounds. Even the bullet that had passed in and out the back of my head had not injured the skull. After an excellent sleep, I was sent the next morning to the casualty clearing station at Cantin, where I had the luck to meet Lieutenant Spranger, whom I had never seen again after we went over the top. He had a rifle bullet through the thigh. After a short stay in the Bavarian Field Hospital No. 14, Montigny, we were conveyed to Douai and there put in a hospital train for Berlin. There, after 14 days nursing, my wounds healed up again as well as their 5 predecessors had done. To my sorrow, I heard in Hanover that little Schultz, among many others I had known, had fallen during the hand-to-hand fighting. Anyone who saw us celebrating our meeting in a little Hanover bar would hardly have believed we had parted only 14 days before to other music than the peaceful click of billiard balls. English gains. On the 4th of June, 1918, I joined the regiment again. It was out on rest at Vrycourt, now far behind the line. The new commanding officer, Major von Ludechow, gave me command of my old 7th Company. As I drew near my quarters, the men ran to meet me and, taking my things from me, led me in triumph. It was like coming back to a family circle. We occupied a number of corrugated iron huts in the middle of neglected grass fields whose green was lit up with sheets of yellow flowers. This waste of ground, that we had christened Daiwalachai, was grazed by herds of horses. If you went out of the hut, you experienced the disquieting sense of empty spaces that sometimes grips the cowboy, the Bedouin, and every other dweller of the waste. We went for long walks in the evenings in the country road, and looked out for partridges, or for war material hidden in the grass. One afternoon I rode to the sunken road near Vrycourt, where there had been such hard fighting 2 months before. It was thickly edged with crosses, among which I found many a well-known name. Soon the regiment was put into the line in front of Poissec-sur-Mont. We were conveyed by night on lorries, when the cone of light from the parachute lights of night bombers showed up the road as a strip of white in the darkness. Near or far, the rushing swirl of the descending bomb was swallowed in reverberations as it burst. Then the searchlight's quivering arm probed the dark sky for the treacherous nighthawk. Shrapnel burst in a scintillating spray, and tracer shells chased each other in a long chain like fiery wolves. A repulsive scent of corpses hung above this conquered ground. Whether strong or almost imperceptible, it acted on the nerves as an irritant, and wrapped one in a mood of overstrung and eerie foreboding. "Offensive ensigns," I heard a cynic and old soldier say at my elbow, as we were passing for some minutes between rows of dimly seen graves. From the Echit-la-Grande, we marched along the embankment of the Bapaume railway line and cut across country into the line. The shelling was lively, 2 shells of medium caliber fell close by while we were making a brief halt. The memory of the unforgettable night of horror, March 19th, drove us onwards. Close behind the front line, we came on a noisy company that had been relieved, and chance took us past them just as their mouths were stopped by a dozen or two of shrapnel. Heaping them with abuse, my men jumped head over heels into the next communication trench. 3 were hit and had to go back to the field dressing station. I was utterly exhausted when at 3 in the morning I reached my dugout. It was miserably small and promised little for my comfort during the days ahead. A candle glowed red in the indescribable atmosphere. I stumbled over a tangle of legs and brought by the magic word of relief. A string of curses proceeded from a hole like a baker's oven, and then one by one emerged an unshaven face, a pair of battered shoulder straps, a weather-beaten uniform, and 2 clods of earth in which presumably boots were concealed. We sat down at a so-called table and went through the business of handing over, in which each tried to do the other in to the tune of a dozen iron rations and a few Vrycourt light pistols. My predecessor was then disgorged into the open through the narrow entry, prophesying as he went that the rotten hole would not last another 3 days. I remained inside, the new captain of Sector A. I surveyed our trench next morning and found little to cheer me. I had scarcely left the dugout when I met 2 coffee carriers bleeding from wounds inflicted by shrapnel bullets in the communication trench. A few steps further, Fusilier Ahrens reported to me a hit from a ricochet. We had the village of Vrycourt in front of us and Puissac-Saint-Mont behind. The company was without support in a front line that was both shallow and narrow, and we were separated from the 76th Infantry Regiment on our right by a large unoccupied gap. The left flank of the regimental front comprised a piece of splintered woodland, known as Wood 125. By orders, no deep dugouts were excavated. The men were accommodated 2 at a time in little dugouts held up by so-called 10 Siegfrieds. As my dugout was situated behind quite another part of the front, the next thing I did was to seek new quarters. A hut-like affair in a length of trench that had fallen in seemed to me to meet the case when I had put it into a defensible state by collecting a few lethal instruments there. Once installed, I lived a hermit's life among fields of green, disturbed only by an occasional runner or orderly who carried the paper war even to this retired spot. One was able to shake one's head between 2 shell bursts over many matters of grave importance, such as that the town major of X had lost a terrier with black spots, answering to the name of Zippy, if one had not lost oneself with savage humor in the suit for maintenance of the servant girl Maccaben against Corporal Megger. The pro formas and returns, too, provided us with needful distraction. One was able to keep so fully occupied with the inner organization that time was scarcely left over for the little affair of holding the line. And indeed, one was asked little about it. It often appeared that collecting empty cartridge cases was of far greater importance. Whenever the visit of a superior officer was announced, I hurried along the trench collecting paper and cartridge cases and instructing the men on guard how they were to report themselves and click their heels together. Also, that they were not to commit the crime of averting their eyes from the enemy in the course of the operation, though not even the tip of the enemy's nose had been seen for 3 months, nor even to let their rifles out of their hands. The sure reward was 3 days' solitary confinement. These things were typical of us and did much harm. The letter stifled the spirit. The war was bureaucratized. At the same time, the front-line officer had far too much discipline in his bones to raise these matters, though they were the object of curses in every platoon commander's dugout. Yet it was for him to fuse the old Prussian spirit with the methods of modern warfare. To return to my dugout, to which I gave the fine name, Wanfried House. Its roof was my only worry, for it could only be described as relatively shell-proof. That is, only so long as it was not hit. However, I comforted myself with the thought that I was no worse off than the men. Every afternoon, my batman put a blanket down in an immense shell hole approached by a sap we had excavated, and there I had a sunbath. My siesta was, I confess, frequently interrupted by the bursts of shells nearby, or the whiz of bomb splinters when we were bombed from the air. We were often heavily shelled at night. I lay on my bunk on a mattress of fresh grass and listened with a quite peculiar and quite ungrounded sense of security to the shells falling around, while the soil descended in showers at each shock. Or else I went outside and looked from the fire step across the sad night landscape that was in such strange and indescribable contrast to the fiery spectacle whose dance floor it was. At such moments, there crept over me a mood I had never known before, a certain falling off of the fighting spirit, a war weariness occasioned by the length of time I had been exposed to the war's excitements. Nothing but war and danger, not a night that was not convulsed with shells. The seasons succeeded each other. Winter came and then summer, and one was always in the war. Tired of it and used to it, one was all the more dispirited and fed up with it just because one was used to it. One was blinded no longer by appearances. The war had raised deeper problems of its own. It was a singular time. The front line had comparatively little to suffer from the enemy fire. Otherwise, it would have been untenable. It was Pusieux and the hollows near it that were chiefly and almost continuously shelled, and in the evenings the bombardment rose to a quite extraordinary intensity. Ration parties and reliefs were consequently very risky matters. On the 14th of June I was relieved at 2 in the morning by Cuss, who had also returned and was in command of the 2nd Company. We spent our time on rest behind the railway embankment at Hachette-le-Grande, which gave shelter to our huts and dugouts. The English shelled time after time with heavy, low-trajectory shells. The quartermaster sergeant of the 3rd Company, Rackbrand, fell a victim. A few days before this there had been an appalling disaster. A bomb had been dropped in the midst of the band of the 76, while a crowd stood round listening. There were many of the 73rd, too, among the casualties. There was a cluster of shell-shocked tanks quite close to the embankment, and I often went to look at them. They bore names that were sometimes humorous, sometimes defiant, and sometimes affectionate, and they were camouflaged with paint. But they were all in a pitiable plight. The little cabin of armored plates, now shot to pieces, with its maze of pipes, rods, and wires, must have been an extremely uncomfortable crib during an attack, when the monsters, hoping to baffle the aim of our guns, took a tortuous course over the battlefield like gigantic, helpless cockchafers. I thought more than once of the men in those fiery furnaces. On the morning of the 18th, the 7th Company had to return to Pusieux on account of the uncertain state of affairs there, to be at the disposal of the CO of the troops in the line for carrying parties or any other purpose. We occupied cellars and dugouts on the edge of the village nearest Vrycourt. Just as we arrived, a salvo of heavy shells went up in the surrounding gardens. In spite of this, I did not refrain from breakfasting in the little arbor at the entrance of my dugout. After a while there was another of them, so I made a dash for it. It went up quite close. A stretcher-bearer of my company, named Kinziora, who was passing by with some dixies of water, was hit in the lower part of the body. As we bound him up, great drops of sweat stood on his forehead, and when I tried to comfort him, he groaned out, "It is a mortal wound. I can tell that well enough." In spite of this prophecy, I shook him by the hand half a year later on our entry into Hanover. In the afternoon I took a solitary walk through Pusieux. The village had already been pounded to a heap of ruins by the Somme battle, and now shell holes and wreckage of walls wore a mantle of green from which the white discs of the ruin-loving elder shone out on every side. Numerous more recent bursts had made rents in this mantle, and once more laid bare the soil of the gardens, so often churned up already. The village street was fringed with the refuse of the advance now come to a standstill. Shell-shot wagons, abandoned ammunition, the weapons of hand-to-hand fighting, skeletons of half-decayed horses, surrounded by the hum of a myriad of flies, all told of the vanity of all things in the fight for life. The church that occupied the highest point of the village consisted of nothing now but a dreary heap of stones. When I picked up a bunch of wonderful roses in a waste garden, a few shells came to remind me of prudence in this dancing place of death. After a few days we relieved the 9th Company in the line of resistance, about 500 meters behind the front line. 3 of my men were wounded in the course of the relief. Captain von Lebedeur was wounded in the foot next morning by a shrapnel bullet close to my dugout. Though far gone in consumption, he felt that fighting was his vocation. It was his fate to succumb to this slight wound. He died soon after in the hospital. On the 28th, Sergeant Grunner, who was in charge of my ration party, was hit by a shell splinter. This was the 9th casualty in the company within a few days. After we had been a week in the front line, we had again to occupy the line of resistance, since our relief battalion was pretty well disbanded owing to Spanish influenza. With us, too, several men reported sick daily. Influenza was so severe in the neighboring division that an enemy flyer dropped a pamphlet to say that the English would undertake the relief if the troops were not taken out soon. We heard, all the same, that the malady was spreading more and more on the other side, too. With us, the effects were worse, owing to undernourishment. In addition, we were kept in constant readiness for an attack, as Wood 125 was being shelled incessantly with an intensity that boded no good. Many of the 6th Company, who were in line there, were down with carbonic oxide poisoning. Some of them were only saved by an oxygen apparatus. One afternoon, while walking along the trench, I found several buried cases of English ammunition, and blew off the tip of my right forefinger through foolishly taking a rifle grenade to pieces. The same evening, while I stood talking to Lieutenant Springer on the top of my dugout, a heavy shell went up close to us. We argued over the distance it was from us, and Springer estimated it at 10 meters, I at 30. In order to see how far I could rely on myself in such matters, I measured it and found the shell hole 22 meters away from where we were standing. People are very apt to underestimate distances. On the 20th of July, I was again with my company at Puiseux. I spent the whole afternoon standing on the ruins of a wall and watching the front line, where, it seemed to me, something very suspicious was going on. Wood 125 was often veiled in the smoke of violent shelling, while green and red lights were rising and falling. Often the artillery fire was silent, and the tack-tack-tack of a machine gun could be heard, and the faint reports of distant bombing. From where I stood, the whole thing was like a pretty game. It had not the majesty of a first-class battle, and yet the relentless strife between 2 brazen forces was there to see. All over the empty expanse there were hidden eyes fixed on the little wood, round whose shuddering oak tops fountains of brown earth danced in ever-changing figures. All round, distributed in trenches, shell holes, caverns, and ruins, were men and guns, awaiting their turn in the battle for a piece of ground covered with splintered trunks. Far behind, at opposite poles, two generals are seated at tables spread with maps. There is a report, a brief exposition, a few words to a staff officer, a conversation on the telephone. An hour later, a fresh bombardment tears up the old shell holes, and a fresh hecatomb of men bleeds in the suffocating fumes. Towards evening I was summoned to the headquarters of the troops in reserve, and there learned that the enemy had got a footing on the left flank of our trench system. In order to make a little room in front of us again, the order was that Lieutenant Peterson with the storm company was to clear the hedge trench that ran along the side of the wood, and I with my fellows the communication trench running parallel to it in a hollow of the ground. We moved off at dawn, but before we left our jumping-off place, the rifle fire became so violent that we abandoned the enterprise for a time. I gave orders to occupy Elbinger Alley, and made up for my broken night's sleep in an immense cavern of a dugout. At 11 in the morning, I was awakened by the noise of bombs from the left flank, where we held a block. I hurried to the spot and found the usual scene in this description of fighting. White clouds of bomb smoke hanging over the trench, and a few traverses back, a machine gun rattling from either side, while in between there were men bending forward and jumping, now forward, now back. The little coup de main was already beaten off, but it had cost one man, who lay behind the block, torn by bomb splinters. Towards evening I had orders to lead the company back to Puiseaux, and then, on arrival, I was ordered to take two sections and join in rolling up the trench in the hollow. At 3:40 we, that is to say, Lieutenant Voigt of the Storm Company with a storm troop, and I with my two sections, set off for the starting point. Our instructions were to roll up the trench from the red point K to red point Z, after 5 minutes artillery and trench mortar preparation. I cannot deny that both of us considered the artillery preparation, and in fact the taking and occupying of the trench, as unnecessary and ill-judged. The trench lay in the bottom of a hollow and was overlooked from all sides. The decisive point was the hedge trench. If an attack was to be made, it was essential to take it, and it automatically gave possession of the hollow. I cherished the firm suspicion that this operation had been ordered from the rear and by the map, for it could not have occurred to anyone who had seen the lie of the land to give such orders as these. After the artillery preparation, which cost us one man wounded, we advanced and rolled up the trench. Shortly before 2 we encountered opposition and bombed our way through it. As we had gained our objective and were not disposed for further fighting, we made a block and posted a section with a machine gun behind it. The only pleasure I had in the affair was the behavior of the men of the storm troop, who reminded me forcibly of Grimmelhalsen's Simplicissimus. These young warriors, with great shocks of hair and puttees, fell into a hot dispute 20 meters from the enemy, because one of them had called the other a rabbit. They cursed like troopers, and vaunted themselves with mighty boasts. "Look here, we are not all such funks as you," one of them shouted at last, and rolled up 50 meters of trench by himself. By midday the section holding the block came back. They had had casualties, and could hold out no longer. I had already given them up for lost, and was surprised that anyone at all had been able to pass along this trench and still be alive. That is what comes out of a war on paper. In spite of our counterattacks, the enemy still had a firm footing on the left flank of our front line, and in the strongly barricaded communication trenches, and so threatened our support line. On the 24th of July, I went to the new C sector of the support line to find my way about, as I was to take it over the next day. I got Lieutenant Gipkins, commanding the company, to show me the block at the hedge trench, and sat down beside him on a fire step. Suddenly, Gipkins seized hold of me and pulled me to one side. Next moment a shot flew into splinters on the very place where I had been sitting. By lucky chance, he had seen a rifle barrel slowly pushed out of a loophole in the block only 40 meters from us. The keen eye of an artist had saved my life, for any fool could have hit me at that range. I was told later that 3 men of the 9th Company had already been shot through the head at this apparently harmless spot. In the afternoon, I was tempted from my coal hole by some not particularly violent artillery fire, though I was at the moment comfortably reading over a cup of coffee. On the front there were signals for the barrage going up incessantly. Wounded men, limping back, told us that the English had penetrated sectors B and C in the support line and occupied the ground in front of Sector A. Immediately after came the bad news that Lieutenants Vorbeck and Grishaber had fallen while defending their sectors, and that Lieutenant Kastner was badly wounded. At 8, too, Sprenger, till now in temporary command of the 5th Company, came to my dugout with a splinter in his back. After fortifying himself with a pull at the bottle, he went on to the dressing station, quoting, back now, Don Rodrigo." His friend, Lieutenant Domeyer, followed him, bleeding from the hand. Next morning we relieved C sector, which had meanwhile been cleared of the enemy. There I found pioneers Boget and Kuss with a detachment of the 2nd Company, Gipkins with what remained of the 9th. 8 dead Germans lay in the trench, and 2 English, cap badge, South Africa, Otago rifles. All had been roughly handled by bombs. Their fearful injuries were written on their faces, distorted by anguish. Both eyes of 2 men were shot away. While I was greeting Boget and Kuss in our usual tone of ironical pessimism, I felt the look of horror in the eyes of a new recruit, a seminarist, who was gazing at me. Looking along the channel of his thoughts, I had a shock when I realized for the first time how callous the war had made me. One got to regarding men as mere matter. I had men posted at the block and the trench cleared of the dead. At 11:45, without any warning having been given us, our artillery opened out on the position in front of us with the utmost fury. The result was more casualties for us than for the English, and it was not long for before the tale of woe opened. The cry for stretchers came along the trenches from the left. Hurrying along, I found what was left of my best platoon commander, a shapeless mess, in front of the block in the hedge trench. He had a direct hit in the loins from one of our shells. The fragments of his uniform and clothing, torn from his body by the force of the explosion, were hanging above him on the splintered remnant of a thorn hedge. I had a ground sheet thrown over him, to spare the men the sight. Immediately after, 3 more men were wounded at the same spot. One of them had both hands severed at the wrist. He staggered to the rear, covered with blood, both arms resting on the shoulders of a stretcher-bearer. Lance Corporal Ehlers writhed on the ground, stupefied by the explosion. I sent protest after protest to headquarters, vigorously demanding either the cessation of firing or the presence of artillery officers in the trench. Instead of any reply, a heavy trench mortar joined in with the rest and made the trench an utter shambles. Blood and brains and pieces of flesh were everywhere, and at once collected swarms of flies. At 7:15, I had orders from which I learned that at 7:30 the fire would be increased. That at 8, 2 sections of the Storm Company were to rush the block in the hedge trench and roll it up as far as Red Point A, and then to get into touch on the right with a shock troop that was to make an attack parallel with theirs. 2 sections of my company were to follow on and occupy the trench. I made the necessary arrangements with all speed while the artillery fire set in, detailed the 2 sections, and had a word with Lieutenant Voigt, who a few minutes later advanced as ordered. I took the matter more as an evening walk than anything else, and strolled along behind my two sections, wearing a cap, a stick bomb under my arm. At the moment of the attack, every rifle anywhere near was directed upon the hedge trench. With heads bent, we made our way in jumps from one traverse to the next. In front of us all went splendidly. The English fled to a line behind, leaving one dead. I was bringing up the rear and had just passed the mouth of a trench branching off to the left, when the man ahead of me, an NCO, gave an excited shout and fired past my head to the left. As I could not explain his conduct to myself, I went a few steps back and found myself faced of a sudden by a powerfully built Englishman, just at the moment when he was lobbing a bomb after the flying NCO. At the same time, shouts rose to all sides. They were coming on over the top to cut us off. I drew forth the bomb, my only weapon, and dropped it at the feet of the Tommy. Then I took to my heels in the direction of our lines. One man only, little Wilczek of my company, had the presence of mind to run after me. An egg bomb was thrown after us, and it tore his belt and the seat of his trousers without doing him any further injury. Voigt and the rest of the men who had gone the other way were apparently surrounded and done for. Continued shouts and explosions of bombs showed that they were selling their lives dearly. In the hopes of coming to help, I led fallen Jonker Mormon's section forward along the hedge trench. However, we were brought to a stop by a hail of bursting Stokes bombs. A splinter flew against my chest and was caught in the claps with my braces. Besides this, there was a sudden onset of artillery fire. Fountains of earth were sprayed up out of colored smoke. The blare of flying metal screamed athwart the blunt roar of heavy shell bursts. The hum of approaching shells came to an end with alarming suddenness. A cloud of splinters sang and whizzed about us. As an attack might be expected, I picked up a helmet and put it on, and hurried back with a few men to the trench. Above we saw figures appearing, so we lay down on the edge of the trench and opened fire. Near me, a new recruit was feverishly fingering the trigger of his machine gun, without succeeding in getting a shot out of the barrel, till I snatched the thing out of his hands. A few English dropped. The rest disappeared into their trenches again, while the artillery fire grew more furious. As for our own, it took sides no longer. When I was walking to my crib, followed by an orderly, something struck the trench wall between us, and, whipping my helmet off my head with enormous force, threw it far away. I thought that I had got the whole charge of a shrapnel shell, and lay half-stunned in my foxhole. A moment later, a shell struck the verge of it and filled the small space with thick smoke. A long splinter smashed a box of gherkins at my feet. To prevent myself being buried, I crept out into the trench again, and was able at least to rouse the two orderlies and my batman and put them on the lookout. It was a really unpleasant half-hour, and the company had many losses. When the worst of it was over, I went through the trench to take stock of the damage and ascertain what men I had left. As the count of 15 men was not enough for holding the trench, I left the defense of the block to Mormon and 3 men, and withdrew the remainder to a giant shell hole behind our line that had all the available bombs collected there. My plan was to let the enemy, if they attacked, enter our trench unopposed, and then at a signal, blow them to bits from above. However, the battle confined itself to the incessant uproar of light trench mortars, rifle grenades, and bombs. On the 27th of July, we were relieved by a company of the 164th Infantry Regiment. We were indeed utterly exhausted. The officer commanding the company was seriously wounded while marching into the line, and a few days later my crib got hit and buried his successor. We all breathed more freely when we had left Puisseux behind us, and the rising storm of the final offensive that growled around it. 111 Infantry Division. Divisional Headquarters, 12/8/18. The 73rd Fusilier Regiment has added in the most brilliant fashion to its high reputation as a brave and war-tried unit in the severe fighting which was renewed against an enemy much superior in numbers. I am all the more glad to recognize this as I know what high demands in endurance and loyalty to duty in our country's cause must have been made on the troops of the division during this long spell in the line on a difficult front. In particular, Lieutenant Younger earned fresh recognition. Already 6 times wounded, he was on this occasion, as always, a shining example to both officers and men. Signed, Von Busse, Major General and Commander of Division. My last storm. On the 30th of July, 1918, we went into rest at Sauchet-l'Estrée, a delightful spot in Artois surrounded by water. A few days later, we marched still further back to Escudivrays, a small, snug, working-man suburb of Cambrai. I occupied the typical best bedroom of an artisan's house in northern France. The large double bed has its ominous piece de resistance, a fireplace with hideous red and blue glass vases on the mantelpiece, a round table, chairs, on the walls some of those frightful color prints of the Famille Steri, Viva la Classe, Souvenir de Première Communion, postcards, and other rubbish. I did what I could to give the right note to my arrival by throwing a pack of cards on the table and my riding boots on the double bed. The clear moonlit nights favored the visits of enemy bombers, who gave us a notion of the overwhelming superiority of material possessed by the other side. Night after night, several formations came over and dropped their bombs of alarmingly high explosives over Cambrai and its suburbs. I was not agitated so much by the fine mosquito-like hum of the engines and the series of reverberating detonations as I was by the dash of my host for the cellar. It is true that, one day before my arrival, a bomb had landed in front of the windows and flung the gentleman of the house, half-stunned, out of the bed in which I slept, broken a bedpost, and bored the walls of the house with splinters. It was precisely this accident which lulled me into the belief that a repetition of it would be unlikely. After one day's rest, the detested but indispensable round of training set in once more. Drill, instruction, roll calls, lectures, and inspections filled a great part of the day. One entire morning was spent in pronouncing a verdict in a court of honor. Here, too, we were miserably fed. For a long while there was nothing for supper but gherkins, which the men very dryly and aptly named gardener's sausage. It was by no means easy to weld my decimated company into a unit again. It often went against the grain to be always insisting of the details of the drill and my relations with the men, convinced though I was of the necessity. Drill as the means to an end is indispensable to every army. It cannot be replaced entirely by individual training, nor by sporting instinct. A man, unless his inherent worth is beyond all doubt, must have obedience drilled into him, so that his natural instincts can be curbed by the spiritual compulsion of his commander even in the most awful moments. Above all, I devoted my efforts to the training of a shock troop, as it had become more and more clear to me in the course of the war that all success springs from individual action, while the mass of troops gives impetus and weight of fire. Better to command a resolute section than a wavering company. I spent my leisure time reading, bathing, shooting, and riding. On my rides, I found vast quantities of literature thrown down from aeroplanes. It was designed to hasten the moral deterioration of the army. Among it was even Schiller's poem of Britannia the Free. It seemed to me very clever of the English to bombard us with poetry, and also very flattering to us. A war in which one fought with verses would indeed be a treat. The reward of 30 pfennigs, set on the head of each copy by the military authorities, showed that they did not undervalue the danger of this weapon. The cost of this, it is true, was laid upon the occupied territory. So it would appear we possessed no longer the wholly pure understanding of poetry. One afternoon, I got a bicycle and rode into Cambrai. The dear old town was a desert. Shops and cafes were shut. The streets seemed dead in spite of the field-gray uniforms that thronged them. Mr. and Mrs. Plancott, who had given me such a fine billet a year before, were delighted by my visit. They told me the conditions of life in Cambrai had got worse in every way. They complained particularly of the frequent visits the night bombers paid them. They often had to run downstairs and up again several times a night, disputing the point as they went whether it was better to die in the first cellar by the bomb itself, or in the lower one by being buried alive. The old people's careworn looks made me heartily sorry. A few weeks later, when the town was shelled, they had to leave the house where they had spent their lives, at a moment's notice. On the 23rd of August, I was alarmed by a violent knocking at my door at 11, when I had sunk into a happy sleep. It was an orderly with marching orders. Already the day before, the monotonous roll and stamp of unusually heavy artillery fire had surged over and warned us on duty, at meals, at cards, to have no illusions about being on rest much longer. We had coined an expressive front-line expression for this distant thunder of guns. Es wummert. We packed up in haste, and were soon marching on the road to Cambrai in a storm like a cloudburst. Our destination was Marquion, and we reached it at 5 in the morning. The quarters allotted to the company were a farmyard, surrounded by demolished farm buildings, in which each man found shelter as well as he could. I, with my one company officer, Lieutenant Schrader, crept into a little dungeon of brick that had apparently, in more peaceful times, been a goat shed, but was now occupied only by several large rats. At midday there was an officers' powwow, at which we heard that we were that night to take up a position in readiness on the right of the great Cambrai-Bapaume road, not far from Bigny. We were warned that an attack by the new swift and more easily maneuvered tanks was probable. I paraded my company in battle order in a small orchard, and then, standing under an apple tree, I said a few words to them as they stood round me in a horseshoe. The expression on their faces was serious and manly. There was little to say. By this time there was not a man who did not know that we were on a precipitous descent, and the fact was accepted with an equanimity that only the moral force which in every army accompanies its armed force can explain. Every man knew that victory could no longer be ours, but the enemy should know that he fought against men of honor. On such occasions I took care not to be carried away by a spirit of daredevilry. It would hardly have been appropriate to show that one looked forward to the battle with a certain joy in the face of the men whose dread of death was in many cases increased by anxiety for wife and child. It was also my principle not to raise their courage by big words, nor to threaten the coward. I spoke rather to this effect: I know well enough that no one will leave me in the lurch. We are all afraid, but we must fight against it. To be overcome by one's weakness is only human. At such a moment, look to your leader and your fellows. While I spoke, I felt what I said went home, and the results justified me in this psychological preparation. Schrader and I had our meal at night on a door laid on a wheelbarrow in the farmyard, and drank a bottle of wine. We then rolled ourselves up in our goat shed, till the guard woke us at 2 a.m. with the announcement that the motor lorries were in the marketplace, ready to load up. In the ghostly light, we rattled along the war-torn country of last year's Cambrai battle, through villages in grotesque states of destruction, with their streets bordered by billows of wreckage. Just before Bugny, we were unloaded and led to our position. The battalion was occupying a hollow on the road Bugny-Vaux. During the morning, an orderly brought orders for the company to push onto the road Vrycourt-Vaux. This typical forward movement made me sure that we were in for it till nightfall. I led my 3 platoons strung out in file, through a country over which aeroplanes circled, dropping bombs and scattering bullets. When we reached our objective, we dispersed into shell holes, as an occasional shell came over the road. I felt so bad that day that I lay down at once in a small length of trench and fell asleep. When I awoke, I read Lawrence Sternay's Tristram Shandy, and thus the afternoon went by, while I lay in the sun with the apathy of an invalid. At 6:15, a dispatch rider summoned the company commanders to Captain Von Way. I have to make the serious announcement that we are to attack. After half an hour's artillery preparation, the battalion will advance at 7 from the western edge of Favril and storm the enemy lines. You are to march on the church tower at Sapignes. After brief coming and going and a hearty handshake, we rushed back to our companies, as the artillery fire began in 10 minutes, and we still had a good way to march. By sections in single file at 20-meter interval, direction, half left, treetops at Favrel. A good sign of the spirit that was in the men now as ever was that I had to detail one man to stay behind and tell the cookers where to go. No one would volunteer. I walked far ahead of the company with my company staff and Sergeant Major Renique. The shots of our guns were bursting out from behind hedges and ruins. Their fire sounded more like a furious yapping than a wave of destruction. Behind me I saw my sections advancing in perfect order. Close to them, like dust, flew the clouds of shot from aeroplanes. The shrapnel, bullets, empty shells, and driving bands drove with a hellish whir between the files of the thin human line. On the right, Vrycourt lay under heavy shell fire, and jagged fragments of iron hurtled heavily overhead and drove with a sudden jab into the clayey ground. Our advance was still more unpleasant behind the Vrycourt-Bapaume road. A salvo of HE went up madly behind and before and among us. We scattered and threw ourselves into shell holes. The smoke of shell after shell hung in clouds over the edge of Favrel, and through it rose and fell again brown fountains of earth, one rapidly succeeding another. I went forward alone, as far as the first ruined houses, to find the way, and then gave the signal with my cane to follow. The village was fringed with badly shelled huts, and there detachments of the 1st and 2nd Companies assembled by degrees. A machine gun claimed several victims during the last part of the way. Among others, Vice Sergeant Major Balg of my company was hit in the leg. A figure in a brown waterproof came quietly across this fire-swept piece of ground and shook hands with me. Kuss and Boje, Captain Junker and Schopper, Schrader, Schlager, Heinz, Feinson, Holman, and Hoppenrath stood behind a hedge that was raked with lead and iron, and held a great council of war. On many a day of wrath we had fought on one battlefield together, and this time, too, The sun, already low in the west, was to gild the blood of all, or nearly all. Part of the 1st Battalion moved into the park of the chateau. Of the 2nd Battalion, only my company and the 5th had come through the curtain of fire practically without casualties. We worked our way forward under cover of shell holes and ruins to a sunken road on the western edge of the village. On the way, I clapped onto my head a helmet I picked up, a precaution I never took except in critical moments. I was astonished to find Favrel utterly deserted. Apparently, the line of defense had been abandoned by the troops occupying it. Captain Von Wey, now lying alone and severely wounded in a shell hole in the village, had given orders that the 5th and 8th companies were to form the 1st attacking line, the 6th the 2nd, and the 7th the 3rd. As there was nothing to be seen so far of the 6th and the 8th, I decided to go ahead without bothering too long over the distribution of the attack in depth. It was already 7. Looking from between fragments of houses and stumps of trees, I saw an attacking party advance across the open in 2 waves under moderate rifle fire. It must be the 5th. I drew up my men in the sunken road and gave the order to advance in 2 waves. At 100-meter interval, I myself will be between the 1st and 2nd waves. It was our last storm. How often in years gone by had we stepped out into the western sun in a mood the same as now? Les Esparges, Goulimont, Saint Pierre Vast, Langmark, Passchendaele, Mouvrays, Vrycourt, Maury. Again, the carnival of carnage beckoned. We left the sunken road quite according to program, only I myself, as the formula of command finally puts it, suddenly found myself near Lieutenant Schrader, far in front of the 1st wave. Isolated rifle shots rang out in front of us. My cane in my right hand and my revolver in the left, I stumped ahead and, without observing it, left the advancing lines of the 5th Company partly behind us and partly on our right. Meanwhile, I found that my iron cross had dropped to the ground from my breast. Schrader, my Batman, and I began a zealous search for it, in spite of snipers who seemed to be drawing ahead of us. At last, Schrader extracted it from a tuft of grass, and I fastened it securely on again. The ground began to fall. Indistinct figures were seen in motion against a background of brown earth. A machine gun spat out its bullets at us. A sense of aimlessness took hold of me. Nevertheless, we began to charge the double. In mid-jump over a piece of trench, a piercing shock through the chest took away my breath. I spun head over heels with a loud cry and fell stunned to the ground. I woke with a sense of great misfortune. I was pinned between narrow walls of earth, and along a row of crouching figures the cry was taken up. "Stretcher bearers! The company commander is wounded!" An elderly man of another company was leaning over with a kindly expression, loosening my belt and opening my tunic. 2 blood-red circular marks shone out on the middle of my right breast and on my back. I was crippled and chained to earth, and the close air of the narrow trench bathed me in sweat. My good Samaritan revived me by fanning me with my map case. My hope as I struggled for breath was for darkness to come soon, so that I could be carried back. Of a sudden, a hurricane of fire broke on us from Sapignes. It was clear that this unbroken roll, this even and regular roaring and stamping, beckoned more than a defensive measure against so poorly staged an attack as ours. Above me I could see, beneath his helmet, Schrader's strong face. As like a machine he loaded and fired, loaded and fired. A conversation arose between us that recalled the tower scene of The Maid of Orleans. Humorous as it was all the same hardly in my mood, for I had the clear conscience that I was done. Above rose a cry of horror and ran from mouth to mouth. "They're through on the left! We're surrounded!" This gave me back my old strength. I fastened upon a hole that a mole had bored in the trench wall and pulled myself to my feet while the blood poured from my mouth. With bare head and open coat, I stared, revolver in hand, into the fight. Through whitish swatches of smoke, a row of men with packs came on in a straight line. Some fell and lay there. Others turned head over heels like a shot hare. 100 meters in front of us, the last were sucked down into the shell-pocked earth. They must have been young troops, still unacquainted with the effects of the modern rifle, for they came on with all the hardihood of ignorance. As though drawn by strings, 4 tanks crept over the crest of a rise. In a few minutes our artillery had trodden them into the ground. One broke across like a tin engine. On my right, the brave Mormon collapsed with a cry of death. It did not seem that all was lost. I whispered to Fanrik Wilski to creep to the left and enfilade the gap in our line. He came back almost at once and announced that 20 meters from us the show was up and all were surrendering. It was part of the 99th Regiment there, Zabern. I turned round and saw a strange sight. From the rear, there were men coming forward with their hands up. The enemy must already have taken the village from which we went to the attack. The scene became more and more lively. We were surrounded by a circle of Germans and English, and called upon to throw down our weapons. I urged those nearest me to fight it out to the death. Friend or foe were fired on alike. Some who surrounded our little band were shouting, some were dumb. On the left, 2 gigantic Englishmen were using their bayonets in a length of trench from which hands were held up imploring mercy. Among us, too, there was a tumult of voices. "It's all up! Throw away your rifle! Don't shoot, Kameraden!" I looked at the 2 officers who were with me in the trench. They smiled back, and with a shrug let their belts fall to the ground. There was left only the choice of being taken or being shot. And now the moment had come to show whether all that I had often said to the men when on rest about the fighting spirit was more than empty phrases. I crawled out of the trench and staggered off in the direction of Favrel. 2 Englishmen who were taking a haul of prisoners of the 99th Regiment to their own lines barred my way. I shot the nearest one in the middle of the body with my revolver. He collapsed like a dummy figure. The other blazed his rifle at me and missed. These quick movements caused the blood to be driven clear of the lung in deep pulsations. I could breathe more freely and set off at a run over the open beside the trench. Lieutenant Schläger was crouching behind a traverse with a section who were still firing. They joined forces with me. Some English who were going over the open stopped to get a Lewis gun in position and began shooting at us. Except for me, Schläger, and 2 others, not one escaped. Schläger, who had lost his pince-nez, told me that he saw nothing but my map case flying up and down. The continuous loss of blood gave me a lightness and airiness of intoxication. One thing only bothered me, that I might collapse too soon. At last, we reached a half-moon-shaped earthwork to the right of Favrel, whence 6 heavy machine guns were pumping lead on friend and foe without distinction. Enemy shots were sputtering around the parapet. Men danced to and fro in the greatest excitement. An NCO of the Medical Corps attached to the 6th Company tore off my tunic and advised me to lie down at once, otherwise I might bleed to death in a very few minutes. I was rolled in a ground sheet and carried past the outskirts of Favrel. Some men of my own in the 6th Company went with me. After a few hundred paces, we were fired on from the village at close range. The shots went with a smack into the human bodies. The stretcher-bearer of the 6th Company who carried the rear end of my ground sheet was laid out with a bullet through the head. I was dropped as he fell. The small detachment had thrown themselves flat on the ground, and now crept to the nearest hollow, with bullets dropping into the ground all round them. I lay by myself, firmly secured in my ground sheet, awaiting the coup de grace. And yet, so long as a man of my company lived, I was not quite forsaken. Nearby I heard Lance Corporal Hengstman's voice. "I'll take you on my back, sir. Either we'll get through, or at worst, we'll lie where we fall." Unfortunately, we did not get through. Too many rifles aimed at us at almost point-blank range. He took me on his back, with my arms round his neck, but before we had gone very far, there was a metallic report, and Hengstman sank softly beneath me to the ground. I released myself from his arms, that were still clasped together under my knees, and found that a bullet had passed through helmet and temples. This brave man was a schoolmaster's son from Letter, near Hanover. This evil precedent did not deter another from coming to my aid, and venturing on a fresh attempt to rescue me. It was Sergeant Strachowski of the Medical Corps. He took me on his shoulder and carried me safely to the blind side of the rise of ground. It was getting dark. The men found the ground sheet of a dead man, and carried me over a deserted stretch of ground over which, far and near, jagged flashes were flaming up. I had to struggle for breath, one of the most painful sensations there are. The smoke of a cigarette that a man was smoking 10 paces in front threatened to suffocate me. At length, we reached a dressing station in charge of a friend of mine, Dr. Key. He made me a divine lemon squash, and then put me into a refreshing sleep with an injection of morphine. The next day began the usual journey by stages to the rear. The terrible journey by car to the war hospital brought me to the edge of the grave. Then I was in nurses' hands. Though I am no misogynist, I was always irritated by the presence of woman every time that the fate of battle threw me into the bed of a hospital ward. One sank, after the manly and purposeful activities of the war, into a vague atmosphere of warmth. The clear objectivity of the Catholic nursing sisterhoods afforded a welcome exception. I found with them an atmosphere very congenial to soldiering. My wound was made lighter by many expressions of sympathy, and indeed, bodily suffering always increases the sensibility of the inner being. From the Plancots I had a delightful letter, written when the enemy, who was gaining ground very slowly, first began shelling Cambrai. They sent me also a tin of milk they could ill spare, and the only melon their garden had produced. I must not let slip this opportunity of saying that I found many an example among the French civilian population of that internationality of the heart that every decent man and educated soldier ought to uphold. The last of my long series of Batman, too, was no exception to the rest. He stuck by me, though the hospital allowed no provisions to be made for him, and he had to bag what he could in the kitchen. I amused myself once, during the monotonous hours on my back, by counting the number of times I had been hit. I found that I had been hit in all 14 times. 6 times by rifle bullets, once by a shrapnel bullet, once by a shell splinter, 3 times by bomb splinters, and twice by splinters of rifle bullets. Counting the ins and outs, this made precisely 20 punctures, so that I might confidently, with that Roman centurion, Holskin Reiter, take my place in every warlike circle. Certainly, I could at any time assert my claim to belong to one order at least, namely, that of the gold wound stripes. This honor did in fact come to me at this very time, though the gold, certainly, was only yellow lacquered metal. Yet I must confess I had it sewn on my coat with a certain pleasure, for if doctors and professors, for all their correctness, do not look askance upon the stamp of an official title, why should the soldier refuse a visible sign of his gallantry? The worth of an order, as of everything else, lies not on but beneath the surface. And who would grudge a heart that has so often beaten fast in the excitement of battle, for country's sake, the adornment of a bit of enamel as the outward sign? In huckstering times, indeed, when everything turns on money, these things lose their value, for it rests solely within the ideal with which they are bound up. After 14 days, I was lying on the feather mattress of a hospital train. Once again, a German landscape flitted by me, tinged this time with the first dyes of autumn, and once again, as on that time at Heidelberg, I was gripped by the sad and proud feeling of being more closely bound to my country because of the blood shed for her greatness. Why should I conceal that tears smarted in my eyes when I thought of the end of the enterprise in which I had borne my share? I had set out to the war gaily enough, thinking we were to hold a festival on which all the pride of youth was lavished, and I had thought little, once I was in the thick of it, about the ideal that I had to stand for. Now I looked back. 4 years of development in the midst of a generation predestined to death, spent in caves, smoke-filled trenches, and shell-illuminated waste. Years enlivened only by the pleasures of a mercenary, and nights of guard after guard in an endless perspective. In short, a monotonous calendar full of hardships and privation, divided by the red-letter days of battles. And almost without any thought of mine, the idea of the fatherland had been distilled from all these afflictions in a clearer and brighter essence. That was the final winnings in a game on which so often all had been staked. The nation was no longer for me an empty thought veiled in symbols, and how could it have been otherwise when I had seen so many die for its sake, and had been schooled myself to stake my life for its credit every minute, day and night, without a thought. And so, strange as it may sound, I learned from this very 4 years' schooling in force and in all the fantastic extravagance of material warfare, that life had no depth of meaning except when it is pledged for an ideal, and that there are ideals in comparison with which the life of an individual, and even of a people, has no weight. And though the aim for which I fought as an individual, as an atom in the whole body of the army, was not to be achieved, though material force cast us, apparently, to the earth, yet we learned once and for all to stand for a cause, and if necessary, to fall as befitted men. Hardened as scarcely another generation ever was in fire and flame, we could go into life as though from the anvil, into friendship, love, politics, professions, and into all that destiny had in store. It is not every generation that is so favored. And if it be objected that we belong to a time of crude force, our answer is, we stood with our feet in mud and blood, yet our faces were turned to things of exalted worth, and not one of that countless number who fell in our attacks fell for nothing. Each one fulfilled his own resolve. For to every one may be applied the saying from St. John that Dostoevsky put in front of his greatest novel. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. Today we cannot understand the martyrs who threw themselves into the arena in a transport that had lifted them even before their deaths beyond humanity, beyond every phase of pain and fear. Their faith no longer exercises a compelling force. When once it is no longer possible to understand how a man give his life for his country, and the time will come, then all is over that faith also, and the idea of the fatherland is dead. And then, perhaps, we shall be envied, as we envy the saints their inward and irresistible strength. For all these great and solemn ideas bloom from a feeling that dwells in the blood and cannot be forced. In the cold light of reason, everything alike is a matter of expedience, and sinks to the paltry and mean. It was our luck to live in the invisible rays of a feeling that filled the heart, and of this inestimable treasure we can never be deprived. I had the good fortune to be taken out at Hanover, and sent to the Clementine Infirmary. One of my companions there was a young flying man of Richthofen's squadron, named Wenzel, who had shot down 12 of the enemy. The last of them had first shot him through the shoulder. On the 22nd of September, 1918, I had the following telegram. His Majesty the Kaiser has bestowed on you the Order of Pour le Mérite. I congratulate you in the name of the whole division. General von Busse. As soon as I was fit enough, I celebrated this event with Wenzel, my brother, and a few friends. As doubt had been expressed whether we should soon be passed out fit for active service, Wenzel and I felt ourselves compelled to jump again and again over a large armchair. We came out of it, however, very badly. Wenzel broke his arm again, and I was kept in bed next morning with a temperature of 104. In spite of this, it was not long before we were in excellent form for another winter campaign. This was deferred for a while, and we soon had to take part in other battles than we had ever dreamed. Now these two are over, and already we see once more, in the dim light of the future, the tumult of fresh ones. We, by this I mean those of the youth of this land who are capable of enthusiasm for an ideal, will not shrink from them. We stand in the memory of the dead who are holy to us, and we believe ourselves entrusted with the true and spiritual welfare of our people. We stand for what will be and for what has been. Though force without and barbarity within conglomerate in somber clouds, yet so long as the blade of a sword will strike a spark in the night, may it be said, Germany lives, and Germany shall never go under.